I make this opening statement on behalf of over 100 individuals and groups, all of whom are core participants in this inquiry. All of them were subject to undercover police surveillance that was inappropriate, improperly regulated, and which abused their rights. They want answers from this inquiry and ask that this inquiry make recommendations that prevent this experience happening to others. They come from a wide variety of backgrounds, ages, ethnicities, and political views. They share an outrage at the experience that each of them suffered. They deserve answers for the experience they suffered through undercover policing to which none of them should have been subjected. Those officers and their supervisors who committed that wrongdoing must be called to account, as must be the system that permitted it. So their experiences span a period of more than 40 years, from 1968 to the present day. They are people who campaigned and still campaign on a variety of different issues. Some have remained community activists, others have continued to seek justice for family members who were killed. Others have become senior political figures, including members of Parliament and a member of the House of Lords who is also a former Secretary of State. A common feature that unites their experience is that the political surveillance to which they were subjected was not merely out of control, but it was politicized. They expect the evidence to show that through the entire period, undercover policing was severely tainted, corrupted by political motivations and political bias. A lack of structure and oversight allowed political biases and improper motives to become commonplace in the selection of target groups for surveillance. That bias infected the entire decision-making process, from policy and strategic decisions to how operations were carried out and what was considered acceptable. So it is also important to recognize at this early stage that for many of these core participants, the bias that resulted in them being selected for surveillance had a racial dimension. Racial bias is something these core participants would like this inquiry to explore assiduously. You will hear how ordinary people campaigning against racism and police misconduct that unfortunately has been present in British policing for decades were targeted for spying by undercover policing, apparently with the view at times to finding ways to discredit their legitimate campaigns. Our democratic process has suffered as a result of illegitimate and inappropriate undercover surveillance of this kind. We will never know the true cost. Legitimate, important campaigns, such as the one first to be considered by this inquiry, the campaign against apartheid in South Africa, were hindered and targeted inappropriately. The campaigns and the voices that should have been amplified because their cause was the right one were the ones targeted for police action. We as a society will never know what progress we could have had today or how much sooner the progress we have reached would have come if it hadn't been for the political interference by police in those campaigns. That kind of secret, unregulated, out of control, politically tainted undercover policing, importantly, also discredits and undermines legitimate undercover policing work. Spying took place on those involved in campaigns against apartheid, those seeking to achieve justice for loved ones wrongly killed, those campaigning on social and environmental issues. Policing decisions towards those people were deeply flawed. People whose efforts and struggles and the causes they espoused have been vindicated over the years as time has passed. Those are the people who were treated as people to be spied on. What they experienced is shocking. This inquiry will hear that some of the core participants were convicted of criminal offences when they should not have been. The involvement of undercover officers in the very acts that the people were convicted of was hidden even from courts and prosecutors. This inquiry will also hear that some of the core participants were encouraged into their activity by the undercover officers, only then to be targeted by authorities for the very activity into which the undercover police officers had encouraged them. Most insidiously, all of these core participants were subject to spying and reporting on their personal lives. Records and data were stored about them for decades without any justifiable purpose. Information about them was used and shared and may have affected their lives in ways they still do not fully know and may never learn. Of the more than 100 participants for whom I'm making this opening statement, 4 are in tranche 1. 3 are anti-apartheid campaigners: Lord Peter Hain, Ernest Rodker, and Professor Jonathan Rosenhead. The 4th is Celia Stubbs. She was the partner of Blair Peach, who was killed by a police officer in 1979, and she campaigned for police accountability for his killing and against the cover-up that followed it. The remainder of these core participants who are not in tranche 1 have received no disclosure yet. That means that still, even at this stage, as the evidence in the inquiry is about to be heard, they do not know what records were kept about them, what was done to them, and why it was done. It is a state of affairs that leaves them immensely frustrated. They find it unacceptable. The length of the period of undercover activity spanned by these core participants is also important because it reveals that the misconduct this inquiry will be investigating does not belong to a bygone era. Improperly regulated undercover policing and its part in serious injustices has continued to the modern day. The enactment of the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act in 2000 was designed to regulate unlawful behaviour and inappropriate covert surveillance, but it did not prevent this activity from continuing. In fact, the resilience and protean nature of this form of police misconduct, even after REPA came into effect, is one of the more disturbing features. The core participants are participating in this inquiry because they want the lessons and recommendations from this inquiry, from you, sir, to be forward-looking. The purpose of their participating is not only to understand what went so badly wrong in the past, but also to ensure that there is relevant guidance for policing in the future, in an era of digital undercover policing, in order to stop this kind of misconduct and what led to it from continuing. This inquiry will be investigating a dark and unpleasant chapter of British policing and British political history. The difficulties, pain, and challenges involved make this a unique opportunity for much needed reflection and change. If embraced properly, the inquiry should be a moment for much needed change. These core participants are keen, finally, to learn the details of the life-changing state interventions that have been kept hidden from them for so long. The information made available to date by the police and the inquiry has been limited and tightly controlled. These core participants all want the fullest disclosure and transparency so all lessons can be learned. For one core participant, Robert Banbury, his frustration with the disclosure provided by the inquiry to date is such that he wishes to say, "I make no statement because this inquiry has been intentionally rendered incapable of achieving its objectives and is in contempt of its obligations." That was his view. So in order to give some structure to the rest of the opening, it might be helpful to indicate it falls in three parts, which explain how the core participants were targeted and how they were affected. Section one, is the targeting of political and social justice campaigns. That is a section I will be dealing with for most of the rest of this morning. Section 2 is the targeting of family justice campaigns and community organizations. And section 3 is the participation of undercover officers in protests and the miscarriages of justice. In covering those three sections, there are also 5 recurring themes that occur within each section. First, the unjustified and politicized nature of undercover policing. Second, the lack of any effective system of checks and balances. Third, the lack of any proper oversight. Fourth, racial bias and racism that occurred within undercover policing. And fifth, a culture of contempt and abuse towards the rights of those targeted, including gross disregard for breaches of fundamental human rights. So at the conclusion of this opening statement, we set out the questions each of those core participants want this inquiry to answer. So I begin with section 1, the unjustified and disproportionate targeting of political and social justice campaigns. This occurred for the entire period for which these core participants are covered in this inquiry. On many occasions, the activities of undercover officers went beyond just attendance and observation of groups. Undercover officers took on active roles within the campaigns, influencing the political direction of the campaigns and the means of protest chosen. At times, they took key instigating roles in the very activity they were targeting for surveillance. The implications of this are profound. Police officers taking an active role in the political direction of the movements they infiltrated. This, we suggest, is the very antithesis of what many believe British political culture, our democracy, should be about. In his 1968 paper, Penetration of Extremist Groups, in which Conrad Dixon suggested setting up the SDS, he wrote, "A firm line must be drawn between activity as a follower and a leader, and members of the squad should be told in no uncertain terms that they must not take an office in a group, chair meetings, draft leaflets, speak in public, or initiate activity." We will hear evidence that this firm line was crossed by officers within the first few years of the unit's existence. The Home Office's terms of reference for Special Branch, produced in April 1970, stated, "It is important that special branches should have a clear idea of what constitutes persons and organizations which may be judged to be subversive by the state." And it went on to say, broadly speaking, these are any organizations and individuals whose purpose is the undermining or overthrow of the established democratic order. So it is hard to see how the groups we described below could possibly meet this definition of organizations seeking overthrow of the established democratic order, unless this is read as a proxy for meaning any group seeking meaningful social or political change. The anti-apartheid movement of the 1970s. The surveillance of these core participants began in 1969 when officers from the SDS began to target the anti-apartheid movement and related groups. I wonder if we could have image 1, document 008, please, document 008 on the screen. Thank you. These were campaigners advocating against UK support of one of the most vile and racist practices of the late 20th century. To the extent that the SDS viewed anti-apartheid campaigners or those with whom they associated as a greater threat to the stability of our society than those who supported apartheid and often used violence in their support of apartheid, is in many ways shameful. And that shameful error is not something that could only be clear with hindsight. It should have been clear at the time. Could you take the image down now, please? I seem to have lost my connection. Sorry, so for a moment I thought I'd lost my connection. I think I'm back now. Can I continue? Unfortunately, it appears that undercover policing was from the very beginning deployed with strategic and political decision-making polluted by misguided political motives. And the anti-apartheid movement illustrates this well. They were misguided political movements, some of which will seem abhorrent to the public listening to the evidence of this inquiry. A particular interest of Chief Superintendent Cunningham in the coverage of Black Power groups was noted in Security Services file of a joint meeting on the 17th of January, 1969, with Conrad Dixon purportedly to discuss joint coverage of Trotskyist and anarchist organizations. The anti-apartheid movement was identified as a target for surveillance in the first annual report of the Special Operations Squad in 1969. Black Power groups were also noted as an area where coverage was lacking by the unit. A key feature of the anti-apartheid movement was sporting boycotts. They were recognized as part of the campaign against apartheid in South Africa. The South Africa cricket team planned to tour the UK in 1970, and a campaign was formed to protest against this, the Stop the 70 Tour, or STST. At this point, I turn to the three core participants active in the STST campaign and in the wider anti-apartheid movement in this period. Ernest Rodker, Professor Jonathan Rosenhead, and Peter Hain, now Lord Hain of Neath. The STS's aim was to stop the planned cricket tour by the all-white South African team to England in the summer of 1970. As part of this, it used non-violent direct action to disrupt the all-white Springbok rugby tour of the UK in winter 1969-1970, in order to make clear that the proposed cricket tour in the summer of 1970 should be cancelled. The wider objective was to isolate white South Africa from international support and so help defeat apartheid itself. The importance and contribution these campaigners made to our wider political culture in promoting anti-racism should not be overlooked or minimized. It was significant, in many ways historic. In December 2015, STST's role was recognized at the highest level when Lord Hayne received from South Africa the O.R. Tambo National Award in Silver for his excellent contribution to the freedom struggle. With that background in mind, we noted the way this inquiry was urged to view matters in the opening statement of the designated lawyer. It said this: "The reality is that a significant number of the groups reported on by the SDS had twin objectives, which were essentially totalitarian, furtherance of their own views and the suppression of conflicting views. The job of the police in a liberal democracy is to maintain order and enforce the law as determined by Parliament and the courts." And the designated lawyer's opening statement went on to say, "The SDS cannot fairly be criticised for assisting the MPS to do its job, or the fact that this was incompatible with the totalitarian objectives of the small minority." If that comment is supposed to explain the spying on those in the anti-apartheid movement, it is, we suggest, a bewildering explanation. But there is also a more general problem with that suggestion. It is not simply the job of the police to maintain law and order. It is the job of the police in a liberal democracy, as part of that liberal democracy, to protect and respect our rights. They go hand in hand. They are part of the same process. The hub of the STST campaign was the modest flat of Peter Hayne's parents in Putney. Peter Hayne, Ernest Rodker, and Jonathan Rosenhead were all involved in the STST. But along with them, were also involved a number of undercover officers. One undercover officer involved was Mike Ferguson. He is unusual in this inquiry, in that his real name is known, but not his cover name. His role has been described by other undercover officers as acting as Peter Hayne's, quote, right-hand man. The core participants have been unable to verify this claim because to date they do not know who Mike Ferguson was. His identity remains withheld from them by the inquiry, even though, as we understand it, he is now deceased. Lord Hayne, in particular, remains concerned about this. He is a Privy Councillor. He is a member of the House of Lords. He is a former cabinet minister, a former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, trusted with briefing of extreme sensitivity for police and armed forces. Yet this inquiry has still not allowed him to identify the police officer who spied on him in his parents' home and was supposedly part of his close inner circle. Notwithstanding his considerable experience in public office, he finds that approach difficult to understand. Assuming that Mike Ferguson did play such a role, it is also a matter that it is also a matter of concern that the police officer took on such a prominent position in such a large and significant campaign. This was not simply a case of the police using people within an organisation as informants or covert human intelligence sources. That might have been alarming enough. This was a case of the police trying to control the leadership and direction of a political movement. A serving police officer was put in place to play a key role in the political organisation and to help direct its activity. As a matter of principle, the activities of SDSC as a legitimate civil liberties campaign should have been conducted and directed and led by genuine campaigners, not by police officers. The actions of Mike Ferguson seem to have been well known to others in the SDS at the time, but he was allowed to continue. And this appears to have been a pattern that recurred into the future. As Ernest Rodker has described in his witness statement to this inquiry, and I quote, "We were involved in civil disobedience. We were putting our bodies in the way of apartheid South African tourists. We were not planting bombs. We were not even carrying out wanton acts, like going into the South Africans' rooms and trashing their belongings. We were doing nothing on the scale of what the South African state regime was doing to its majority black citizenship under apartheid, systematically and repeatedly under cover of the law." The actions of undercover officers also continued in the broader anti-apartheid movement. The core participants have the following concerns about the disproportionate level of undercover police officer surveillance. And there are, sir, under this heading, 4 points. First, what justification was there for surveillance of these groups? The anti-apartheid movement was merely a political campaign. Secondly, when you hear what the explanations are supposed to have been, has there been a retrofitting of justifications that were not actually present at the time? We would ask this inquiry to treat with skepticism ex post facto claims seeking to justify surveillance if there are no adequate records to support those claims. Thirdly, why was there wide-ranging data gathering and a lack of proper checks and balances about the data gathering on people? How were those records retained, used, disseminated, and shared? The core participants are concerned that personal information that was recorded about them was of no possible policing use, but may have been used to their detriment in other inappropriate ways. Lord Hayne, in particular, has expressed concern about not knowing how such reports may have been shared and used against those seeking to carry out legitimate public functions. Ernest Rodker's view of the retaining of personal information over a long period is as follows. He says this is also quite sinister. It is not as if I was an international criminal. It is reminiscent of the behavior of authoritarian states. For Ernest Rodker, it has no legitimate justification. And fourth, the core participants have concerns about collusion that took place with the apartheid South African government and Bureau of State Security. It is of concern that from its inception, the SDS appears to have targeted campaigns concerned with the struggle for racial equality. I turn next to London Greenpeace through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. The issues raised in relation to the anti-apartheid movement also apply to actions of undercover officers targeting environmental groups in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. London Greenpeace was established following the publication in 1971 in the pacifist magazine Peace News of an influential article, subsequently expanded and reissued as a broadsheet, Greenpeace, You and Your Environment. This was a compilation of ideas about how individuals could take action in their own lives to preserve the ecosystem. The group was the first Greenpeace group in Europe, one of the first 3 in the world. London Greenpeace campaigned on environmental and social justice issues, initially primarily against nuclear weapons testing. And could we have document 009 on the screen, please? This is the London Greenpeace broadsheet, and although it's impossible to read the text on this screen, if you were able to, you would see the sort of activity, kind of revolutionary activity it promoted was home composting, turning off the lights when they're not in use, putting a brick in your toilet system to reduce the amount of water it uses, doing this in the place of work or study and saying why you've done it, and planting trees, possibly the way it's described, guerrilla tree planting in your area. That was what London Greenpeace was promoting. You can take the image down now, please. London Greenpeace deliberately stayed as a small group of activists, without leaders, with decisions taken by initiative and consensus of those involved, whilst respecting differences of views. It encouraged people everywhere to organise themselves to take practical action and to network with others in order to build up strong and lasting movements to effect real change. In a flyer produced in 1981, the group described itself as follows: the London Greenpeace Group has existed for a decade as an independent group of activists. We share a non-violent and libertarian opposition to the exploitation of the ecosystem. Our origins are a special concern for everyone's personal responsibility to the environment, and in particular, commitment to opposing the ravaging of the environment by militarism. That is how the group described themselves. And in the 1980s, both Bob Lambert and John Dines infiltrated London Greenpeace. Both men have been publicly identified. The actions of both, especially Mr. Lambert, will require serious scrutiny by this inquiry. Could you please put up document 010 on the screen? That is an image of Bob Lambert. He was a key figure in the undercover surveillance of London Greenpeace and is a key figure featuring in the evidence in this inquiry in many ways. Many of his actions as an undercover officer are publicly known, including that he had several intimate relationships with women whilst undercover and fathered a son with one of those women. His behavior, those matters, are truly shocking and unjustifiable, and they will be covered in the opening statements made by others, as will other activities of Bob Lambert, including his role in the McDonald's McLibel campaign. You can take down the picture, please. Bob Lambert infiltrated London Greenpeace in the early 1980s. He took on an active campaigning role within the group and remained active for a number of years. Throughout much of this period, he was simultaneously infiltrating animal rights groups, but he would regularly encourage those in London Greenpeace to join with hunt sabotage and other protests, including offering them lifts to protests in his van. Following his deployment, Bob Lambert returned to the SDS as a supervisor. The story of Bob Lambert in part reveals how misconduct by officers became entrenched as they moved into senior positions and directed others to carry out similar misconduct. Bob Lambert was still undercover in London Greenpeace in 1987 when another undercover officer, John Dines, joined the group. Could we have document 011 on the screen, please? That is an image of John Dines at an anti-McDonald's fair, the London Greenpeace stall at an anti-McDonald's fair. John Dines, who we can see there, went on to become the group's treasurer. He also started an intimate relationship with Helen Steele, living with her in a flat in Tottenham. John Dines had a van and would offer to drive people home from meetings in order to find out their home addresses. He also regularly offered lifts to protest to those in London Greenpeace. John Dines was part of London Greenpeace at the time that McDonald's served libel writs on some of those involved in London Greenpeace. But despite playing an active role in the anti-McDonald's campaign, he did not get served with a writ. You can take the picture down now, please. The core participants from London Greenpeace had the following concerns. 4 concerns. First, the active involvement in the political decision-making of London Greenpeace. As I've said, Bob Lambert was actively involved in influencing the political direction of London Greenpeace. In fact, he authored key documents. Bob Lambert was influential in moving the directions of the campaigning work away from mainly ecology and anti-militarism and steering it towards some of the work around animal rights and the anti-McDonald's campaign. In fact, it was following a conversation with Bob Lambert that London Greenpeace started working on the McDonald's campaign that later led to the libel proceedings. Bob Lambert was on the first demonstration against the company at their outlet on the Strand in January 1985. The second concern London Greenpeace have is the deliberate tactics of building relationship with women. Both Bob Lambert and John Dines deliberately built relationships with women to further their infiltration. As well as the relationships with women who have already publicly come forward, Bob Lambert had a further relationship with another woman who was part of London Greenpeace in the early 1980s. The repeated use of this tactic in London Greenpeace, and as we shall see in later groups, clearly demonstrates that it was a known and accepted method of infiltration that was shared between undercover officers. The effect on the women concerned was truly devastating. The adoption of such tactics was unjustifiable by any measure. London Greenpeace's third concern is the way information was collected, a similar concern to that which I've outlined in relation to the anti-apartheid movement. Again, there was unrestricted and unregulated collecting of information on those conducting legitimate political campaigns. That is a serious infringement of their fundamental rights. The call participants have no idea of the extent to which their lives have been affected by that data gathering, about the data sharing about them, much of which, of course, may have been wholly inaccurate. London Greenpeace's fourth concern is the way information was shared with private companies. Many of the targets of London Greenpeace's campaigns were large corporations, such as McDonald's. The core participants understand that information collected by undercover officers was shared with these private companies who also influenced the surveillance operations. Some of those in London Greenpeace appear on the Consulting Association blacklist, listed as environmental campaigners. As their files were not seized by the Information Commissioner's Office, they do not know exactly what was recorded. But they share the concerns of blacklisted construction workers about collusion between Special Branch and the Consulting Association. Bob Lambert said this about his role in London Greenpeace. I apologise unreservedly for the deception I therefore practised on law-abiding members of London Greenpeace. I also apologise unreservedly for forming false friendship with law-abiding citizens, and in particular forming a long-term relationship with the woman who had every risk to think I was a committed animal rights activist and a genuine London Greenpeace campaigner. But Bob Lambert has also explained his actions in the following way. As part of my cover story, so as to gain the necessary credibility to become involved in serious crime, I first built a reputation as a committed member of London Greenpeace, a peaceful campaigning group. To these core participants, Mr. Lambert's attempt at justification for his actions is not acceptable. It undermines his admission. It aggravates the harm he's already caused. Because it cannot credibly be claimed that it was necessary to infiltrate London Greenpeace to achieve any supposed aim of preventing serious criminality, particularly since London Greenpeace were, on Bob Lambert's own admission, not involved in any such activity. It was not necessary to attempt to influence the political directions of the group to achieve his purported aim. This was a subversion of the democratic process. It was an interference and a breach of their Article 10 and Article 11 rights, the freedom of expression and the freedom of association. It certainly was not necessary to form an intimate relationship in order to achieve those aims. For that reason, the apologies are hollow. Whilst the full extent of the deception practices on London Greenpeace by the SDS still is unknown. In particular, London Greenpeace has concerns that other undercover officers conducted surveillance on London Greenpeace prior to Bob Lambert infiltrating the group, and the details of those undercover officers have not been made known. They have those concerns because it appears very likely that the group was infiltrated by the SDS before Bob Lambert, since a report produced by the Cabinet Joint Intelligence Committee in 1980, stamped Secret UK Eyes A, suggests that by the late 1970s, London Greenpeace was already being spied on by the state. So we've referred to this in detail at paragraph 56 of our written opening statement. I won't quote all of that now, but it is there set out in detail. And it's for that reason that London Greenpeace strongly supports the call for the release of group and individual special branch registry files and all remaining cover names, accompanied by contemporaneous photographs of the officers while undercover. That will enable those who were spied on to give relevant evidence of the inquiry about the impact and the scale of the spying. The next group I'll be referring to is Reclaim the Streets in the 1990s and the 2000s. Reclaim the Streets was a grassroots environmental campaigning group. It was founded in the 1990s to challenge the dominance of car culture over our lived environment. It favoured streets and communities where people could walk, breathe, and live, away from the noise, pollution, and dominance of cars. It's self-evident that many of the ideas which RTS promoted have now been taken up by wider society and public bodies. They are reflected in measures such as the increased number of pedestrianised zones and lower speed limits in residential areas. They demonstrate the role and value of campaign groups in creating progress within society. It's publicly known that an undercover officer, James Boyling, infiltrated the group between 1996 and 2002 using the cover name Jim Sutton. He was centrally involved in planning protests during that time. Another undercover officer using the cover name Jason Bishop was involved in Reclaim the Streets from around 1999 onwards. Jackie Anderson was the cover name of yet another undercover officer involved with Reclaim the Streets. Reclaim the Streets remains concerned that there were other undercover officers whose names have not been revealed, who may have infiltrated their group. During the infiltration of Reclaim the Streets, undercover officers were arrested and tried under their false names and assumed identities. This was never disclosed to the people who were their co-defendants in those trials. The core participants do not even know if people being tried under false names was disclosed to judges and prosecutors. By way of example, Jim Boyling was arrested and tried for a public order offence arising from a protest in 1996 when activists cycled around Trafalgar Square in London to bring traffic to a standstill in support of a strike by tube workers. He was one of a group of protesters who then occupied the nearby office of the chairman of London Transport. Jason Bishop was arrested a number of times during the period of his deployment, and both Jim Boyling and Jason Bishop were active in the May Day 2000 protests. Could we have document 014 on the screen, please? There is the protest, and in the middle of the picture, with his back sort of to the camera, but wearing sunglasses with a shaved head and a white t-shirt, is Jim Boyling. Jason Bishop was alleged to have been arrested driving a van of manure for a, quote, guerrilla gardening protest in Parliament Square, but no charges were brought against Jason Bishop. You can take down the image now, please. From 1999 to 2005, the undercover officer with the cover name Jason Bishop was heavily involved with demonstrations against the biannual Defence and Security Equipment International Exhibition, Arms Fair, at the Excel Centre in London. He attended planning meetings. He provided logistical support as a driver. He attended mass days of action. So the activities of these officers was not random, nor was it speculative. It was part of a continuous pattern of police surveillance and infiltration of grassroots environmental campaigns. From what we know, it appears that Bob Lambert was Jim Boyling's direct supervisor within the SDS. And we know that Bob Lambert had himself spied on groups such as London Greenpeace. Many of the same tactics used by Bob Lambert in relation to London Greenpeace apply here. And we mention them because it shows the continuation and the entrenchment of the way Bob Lambert carried out surveillance as those he was supervising carried it out. The active involvement of undercover officers in political campaigns, the collection of data and sharing with private companies, as we've already mentioned, the politicized and political nature of the policing, targeting groups because of their campaigning objectives. And most significantly, the tactic of abusing relationships with women as a means to further infiltration was used by Jim Boyling just as it had been used by his supervisor, Bob Lambert. It is public knowledge that Jim Boyling formed intimate relationships with, whilst an undercover officer, with 3 women. Again, I leave it to others to express the points that must be made about the effect on those women. However, the wider impact of this on the Reclaim the Streets group should also be noted. There can simply be no justification for the use of such tactics as a means to obtain information about political campaign groups. And the fact that this behaviour mirrors that of Bob Lambert several years earlier emphasises that this was a systematic tactic deployed against activists as a means to further infiltration by undercover officers. I move to the next group now, the Genetic Engineering Network, and the time period is around the late 1990s. The Genetic Engineering Network, or GEN, was set up in 1996 to support local groups campaigning against GM food crops nationwide. The network also disseminated information as well as liaising with many NGOs and other bodies campaigning on these issues in order for their campaign to be more effective. Several undercover officers infiltrated GEN, including Jim Boyling, Jason Bishop, and an officer we'll be hearing more about, Mark Kennedy. Undercover officers were involved in direct action protests to pull up GM crops. Undercover officers also travelled abroad with members of GEN. For example, Jim Boyling travelled to Rome with campaigners from GEN, where they met third world farmers and kick-started the campaign in the UK. Jim Boyling also travelled to Ireland, where he took part in direct action to pull up GM crops. Knowing that inevitably raises the question whether foreign governments were aware that British police officers were committing direct action on their soil. Was this activity authorised by the undercover officers' handlers? On what basis? These examples demonstrate the limitations on the inquiry, focusing on England and Wales only, because that foreign activity is important and has significance, but will not be investigated. I turn now to the Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp in the 2000s. Could we have document 015 on the screen, please? The Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp is a woman-only, anti-nuclear, anti-war group based around a monthly peace camp at the Atomic Weapons Establishment in Aldermaston, the UK's nuclear weapons factory. It was set up in 1985 by women from Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, and it continues to this day. Women of all ages are involved, from age 18 to 80. They are campaigning against nuclear weapons in particular, and war and militarism in general. The camp is a purely political campaign with the aim of stopping the design, development, and production of nuclear weapons production at AWE Aldermaston. Their aim is for the plant to be safely decommissioned, and they have maintained a camp there for 35 years and continue to witness, monitor, and protest the ongoing deployment of the Trident nuclear weapon system. Aldermaston Peace Camp is also one of the few women-only spaces in the country for protest. You can take down the image, please. An undercover officer using the cover name Lynn Watson attended the Peace Camp and training sessions between 2000 and 2004. Core participants believe that she collected personal data and information about them to distribute to other police officers. Given the stated aims and objectives of the camp, there can be no justification for such deployment of undercover officers. They asked the inquiry to consider the disproportionate collection of their data, how that data was retained, how it was processed, how it was shared. But there are a number of other campaigns connected which have not been given core participant status. Because AWPC Aldermaston Women's Peace Campaign grew out of the Greenham Common Women's Peace Campaign. And for several years, the camps and their respective campaigns overlapped. Women from AWPC were involved in Cruise Watch, a group tackling and making public the deployment of US nuclear cruise missiles based at Greenham Common. Notwithstanding the involvement of another undercover officer with the cover name Catherine Bonza with Greenham Common, both Cruise Watch and Greenham Common have been refused core participant status. Women from AWPC were and are still involved in Nuke Watch, which grew out of Cruise Watch, another nationwide group which monitors and tracks convoys of UK nuclear weapons manufactured at AWE Aldermaston, and the related establishment at AWE Burfield from the south of England to the Faslane Naval Base, and the bomb store at at Coolport. Nuke Watch has also been denied core participation status. During the period of Lynn Watson's deployment, other groups active at Aldermaston included Trident Ploughshares, which is a nationwide group, also very active at Faslane, opposing the deployment of the Trident submarine system, and Block the Builders, a group opposing the construction of facilities for manufacturing a new weapon system at AWE Aldermaston. Lynn Watson appears to have attempted to infiltrate those groups as well. I mentioned those other groups and their connection with AWE Aldermaston because these core participants are concerned that by not giving core participant status to those related campaigns, the inquiry is only obtaining a partial picture of this particular area of undercover deployment. I turn next to Trapeze, and the period covered here is the 2000s. Another group targeted by undercover officers at this time was Trapeze, a popular education group that set up around the G8 summit in Scotland in 2005. It was an organisation that gave educational workshops in community centres and universities about climate change and debt. The group also ran pub quizzes, bingo nights along those themes. An undercover officer named Mark Kennedy joined Trapeze, and for a significant 6-month period of time, the group worked, lived, and travelled together, often with Mark Kennedy driving. He also paid for members of Trapeze to travel to Ireland and Germany to meet with other activists. He paid for it. Considering the nature of the group and its activities, the core participants have concerns over how disproportionate the level of spying and invasion was into their personal lives. Moving from trapeze, I turn now to the climate camps, also during the period of the 2000s. In 2006, the first climate camp for, In 2006, the first camp for climate action took place at Drax Power Station. It followed an idea formed by activists at the G8 conference in Stirling the year before. Could you put up document 017 on the screen, please? That's an image of Kingsnorth Climate Camp. In the UK, there were then regular climate camps held until 2010. The camps took place at Drax Power Station, Heathrow Airport, Kingsnorth Power Station, the City of London, Mainshill Wood, Fossey Mine, Blackheath, Ratcliffe-on-Soar, and Edinburgh. The camps were mainly large-scale gatherings, bringing campaigners on climate change together to share ideas and support and to demonstrate sustainable means of living. The camps would also draw attention to major carbon emitters and form a base for protests. You can take the image down now, please. Climate Camp were the target of numerous undercover officers, including the following. Mark Kennedy was involved in the planning for the first climate camp at Drax and was arrested twice during the camp. He also attended the Heathrow, Kingsnorth, and City of London G20 camps. Along with Mark Kennedy, an officer using the cover name Dave Jones was involved in setting up the Drax climate camp, where he worked with Mark Kennedy, leaving before the camp actually opened. Third, Lynn Watson also attended the Drax camp, where it's understood she engaged in sexual activities with a male activist. But it's not known if more undercover officers attended the camps. The activities of undercover officers raise concerns. The concerns are over the political targeting of climate camp, the use of social and intimate relationships with activists to gain information, the widespread collection of data and its subsequent use, and the active involvement of undercover officers in the protests that led to arrests. The next person I deal with is Harry Halpin, and it's in connection with the climate camps. The impact of undercover surveillance on those attending climate camp was felt in many areas. For example, Dr. Harry Halpin is an academic expert in informatics and privacy who worked for Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, at MIT. Harry Halpin has acted in an advisory role and given talks at forums such as the UN, the OECD, and the European Parliament. Dr. Halpin is also an environmental campaigner, and Dr. Halpin was spied on by Mark Kennedy at the Kingsnorth and London G20 climate camps. Dr. Halpin has subsequently had difficulty when travelling. He's been stopped at airports and detained, including being detained under anti-terrorism powers when coming into the UK. He has difficulties obtaining necessary work permits to attend conferences abroad. Mark Kennedy and the UK government also passed information about Dr. Halpin to the US security services, which led them to harass Tim Berners-Lee, Dr. Halpin, and others when Dr. Halpin interviewed for a job at MIT. Dr. Halpin suspects that he has been subjected to a form of blacklisting and this has had an impact on his personal and professional life. The next group is the Cardiff Anarchist Network and the South Wales Anarchists, and the period is 2005 to 2010. The Cardiff Anarchist Network, also later called the South Wales Anarchists, was formed in South Wales and was active between 2005 and 2010. The group had roughly 10 to 12 core members during this period, with more outside activists taking part in their organised protests. The network consisted of autonomous collectives in opposition to all forms of exploitation and capitalism. Their campaigning tactics included direct action. The members of the group regularly held meetings and socialised together. Cardiff Anarchist Network was infiltrated by an undercover officer with the cover name Marco Jacobs. Marco Jacobs first met members of the group in 2004 and began attending meetings the next year. He quickly integrated himself within the group, attending meetings regularly and volunteering for a number of organisational tasks, including taking notes at the meetings. In spring 2006, Marco Jacobs moved to the Cardiff area. He began building friendships with members of the group and frequently causing rifts between them. He had at least 2 sexual relationships with members of the group. He remained an active member for at least 4 years, leaving Cardiff in 2009. It was The Guardian who revealed his true identity in January 2011. The core participants have grave concerns about the tactics used by Marco Jacobs when infiltrating Cardiff Anarchist Network. There can be no justification for his form of exploitation. In addition to the abuse of intimate relationships, the tactic of forming false friendships within the group is something that raises significant concern. He attended the funerals of family members of those he spied on, as well as other personal events. From their perspective, this constituted a gross invasion of the personal lives of those with whom he became involved. The deliberate tactic of sowing rifts between members of the group was a distortion of the political process that they were trying to achieve and an abuse of their freedom of expression and freedom of association. Finally, Marco Jacobs' involvement in the organisation of a protest in 2006 brings into question the safety of subsequent convictions of others who took part in it. And we will address the issue in relation to miscarriages of justice and the involvement of undercover officers in criminal activity further in this opening statement. The next group I'll deal with is Defend the Right to Protest, and the period is 2005 to 2010. Defend the Right to Protest is a national campaigning organisation which includes a network of protester defenders, activists, trade unionists, academics, and lawyers. The organisation campaigns against policing in terms of its policies and practices where they threaten civil liberties and the right to protest. The organisation was formed in 2010, following the mass student-led protests in November and December of that year, in opposition to the then Conservative and Liberal Democrat government's plans to implement spending cuts to further education and increase the cap on tuition fees. The group's aim was to build a collective response to the criminalisation of large numbers of young protesters. The group has also worked with and/or hosted events with a number of individuals, including high-profile figures in British politics and justice campaigns. Information gleaned through subject access requests has confirmed that the group was an identified target of the National Domestic Extremism Unit. Hannah D is the chair of the group. Prior to the formation, Hannah D was a political activist and attended global resistance events between 2001 in 2005. An undercover officer with the cover name Simon Wellings was deployed between 2001 and 2007, infiltrating groups such as Dissent, Global Resistance, and the International Socialist Workers' Party. In 2001, Simon Wellings turned up in the Global Resistance group, claiming to have a job installing security systems. He spent 4 years in the group and was a member of the main committee of around 20 activists who ran the group. Simon Wellings' infiltration was discovered after he accidentally called an activist friend on his mobile phone and was diverted to an answer phone. On the recorded message, he inadvertently left. On the recorded message he inadvertently left, he could be heard the sound of bleeping police radios. Wellings could be heard apparently identifying persons in photographs with another police officer. He was heard to make comments about the personal life of Miss D. The core participants have concerns along exactly the same lines as the other groups that I've mentioned, on the proportionality of the infiltration, on the politicized nature of the surveillance, and on the extent of the data gathering, retention, and sharing about their personal lives. I'll deal now with a general heading of activity outside of England and Wales that took place in the 2000s. And I've touched already on concerns that core participants have about this inquiry's ability to examine activity outside England and Wales. The activity of undercover officers outside England and Wales has been noted above and is also seen in relation to Kirk Jackson. I've mentioned it already, but it comes into focus in this way. Kirk Jackson is a political activist who was organising an anti-militarist campaign in Nottinghamshire. He was approached by undercover officer Mark Kennedy in 2009. Mark Kennedy asked Mr. Jackson to organise a meeting at which a friend of Mark Kennedy's from Berlin would speak to local activists about forthcoming anti-NATO protests in Strasbourg and Baden-Baden. Mark Kennedy instigated the meeting and the publicity for it. And the purpose of that publicity was to encourage UK activists to travel out of the UK to France and Germany in order to participate in the protests, specifically the attempts to blockade the NATO summit, during which hundreds of activists were arrested. Jason Kirkpatrick is a core participant who was himself at the time resident in Berlin. He considered himself to be a close friend of Mark Kennedy during 2005 to 2010. He was invited by Mark Kennedy to stay at his Nottingham home in around 2007. Mark Kennedy visited Mr. Kirkpatrick in his Berlin home multiple times between 2005 and 2009. Mr. Kirkpatrick also met Mark Kennedy across Europe, including in Germany, Poland, the Republic of Ireland, Scotland and Northern Ireland. The German press, politicians, and government ministers have all repeatedly raised questions about Mark Kennedy's activities in Germany. It's clear that undercover officers like Mark Kennedy would regularly travel internationally. Their activities outside the UK, including potential involvement with the security services of other countries, cannot and should not be disassociated from their domestic activities. So having looked at that section in relation to this element of the opening, I have a few comments to make on pulling together the themes that we have talked about in section 1 on targeting of political and social justice campaigns. And I'd like to pull them together really to make 6 points about that section of this opening statement. The concerns we've set out above about the targeting of political and social justice campaigns reveal the following. Firstly, it demonstrates, we say clearly, the politicized nature of the way core participants were targeted. Secondly, there appears to have been no effective regulation, no system in place which constrained or ensured compliance with the law. And that included observing the basic rights of those who were being targeted. Third, as far as the core participants are concerned, the enactment of RIPA in 2000 did not appear to have the intended effect on the proper regulation of surveillance by undercover officers. This isn't a matter of legal nicety. We have set out how this activity continued far into the 2000s, at the time when RIPA, in particular Part 2 of RIPA, should have been providing a framework and a constraint. It did not. And it is important that this inquiry looks carefully at why an Act of Parliament that was supposed to provide a legal framework to regulate this kind of activity, where parliamentarians trusted those who were allowed to act covertly to comply with that regulation, why that failed so comprehensively. Fourth, the collection of data, its use, its retention, and its distribution is a theme and a concern I've outlined in relation to many of the core participants. Again, it seems to have been conducted with little, if any, legal framework in mind. Fifth, the system not only didn't comply with a legal framework, but internally, it seemed to have inadequate controls. There was no meaningful system of oversight that should have constrained the conduct of the officers. The system of oversight appears to have been entirely dysfunctional. Courts and prosecutors were not informed of what was going on, even as they were carrying out legal processes and trying defendants. Senior officers either failed to control undercover officers or gave approval to entirely unacceptable conduct. And finally, sixth, the treatment of the core participants I've outlined in section 1 reveals a culture of abuse and flagrant disregard for the rights of the people on whom they were spying. That culture became entrenched. It happened over years, from the very start, continued by Bob Lambert, John Dines, Jim Boyling, and others during the 90s, 80s, and 90s. But it was continued, leading to the activities of Mark Kennedy, Lynn Watson, and others into the 2000s. The core participants also have concerns about those who've been affected by undercover policing, but who do not have a voice in this inquiry. Restriction orders over the names and photographs of undercover officers, redactions to material disclosed, and restriction orders limiting the circulation of documents prevent groups who have been affected by undercover policing knowing the full extent of what was done to them, and prevents them from engaging meaningfully with this inquiry. So at this point, I would be turning to the second section of our opening statement, the unjustified and disproportionate targeting of family justice campaigns and community organisations.